Lauren,
Dottie.
congratulations on this award.
Thank you.
I can't think of anybody who deserves it more. This, leadership of the year. To me, you're kind of leadership of the century. So let's go from there.
Well, well, Dottie, thank you. That was very, very gracious of you. But when I think of the history of women, whether acknowledged or not, in the context of democracy, I stand on the shoulders of many, many others
We all
who
do.
have taken significant risks and action in order to protect democracy.
Right. And
Yeah.
you stand on a certain level, I stand on, not down, I stand on another level of older people that went before me that were more courageous. I'd like to ask you, first of all, how you see feminism and racism, and how you see the battles that we have struggled, not just now, but back when those other women were putting their shoulders out. I mean, history and now, what do you see the challenges were and still are?
I wrote a piece as I mourned the murder of George Floyd. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Sandra Bland. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And where I said that we in the feminist movement need to confront some realities. That whether we look at suffragism, whether we look at women's marches, throughout the context of history, to be quite honest, the work around inclusion was not done. In fact, there was significantly intentional exclusion in the suffrage movement to exclude Black women. And certainly here in Colorado, as we talk about our being the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment, Native Americans and Chinese were not allowed to be citizens at that time. So the conversation has to continue. Pride was really galvanized by two women of color who also happened to be transgender. If we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, women led that, and among them queer women as well. So the role of women as movement leaders and fighters for democracy, women have been at the forefront, but women of color have not been acknowledged. When we talk about democracy, in the piece that I wrote called Ain't I a Woman, I was quoting Sojourner Truth, who was a profound suffragist and who had to ask that question at a national gathering to be acknowledged and to simply be seen and heard for the meaning of her life in building this country as one who had lived in slavery as well. So I would say that today, as we look at the white supremacists that attacked our nation's capital and capitals around the country over the course of the past week, we have to also remember that white supremacy has been alive and well within this country. I often talk about rivers beneath the river, and white supremacy has always been the river beneath the river, that undertow, that current that can drag us down, that sometimes erupts into a tsunami, a wave, a current that can drag us under. It now cannot be denied by anyone. It is a context and a history with which people of color, and certainly Black people, have lived for as long as we have been in this country. And when I think about as well, within the Navajo Nation, we were talking about that a few moments ago, the death rates on reservations are unconscionable. That is also evidence. When we talk about the separation of families at the border and children in cages, that is also evidence. when we talk about a report that came out from the Institute for Women's Policy Research just a few days ago, saying that 156,000 jobs were lost in December. 16,000 of those were men. That means 140,000 jobs in December were all women. And among those women, Black and brown women made up the predominance of those. In fact, white women significantly advanced over the month of December. So these are not new issues as we look at our current context. The question is whether we can have the courage, as Darren Walker, who's one of my favorite people, president of the Ford Foundation, says that democracy is in fact the threat to white supremacy. So if we care about eliminating white supremacy to build a society that is based on the justices of not only the Constitution, but also the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights, then it is essential that we protect our democracy from anyone who would seek to destroy it, whether within our nation's capital that was built by slaves, enslaved people. We can't forget that as well. And that we do so with vigor. And the reason for that is not just because I am a Black woman, but it is, and that's important to me, seeing Kamala Harris now as the first Black and Indian American woman as vice president-elect, and when this airs, will be vice president of the United States, is extraordinary, certainly for me personally. But it opens up a window of access and opportunity and possibility for all of us. Democracy makes our country better for everyone. The Statue of Liberty, as it stands there, welcoming all people, is not about a few. It is about all. And in particular, the message that it gives is that we must extend our hands in welcome to those who have experienced oppression or who are poor.
Do you have any hope, I know that I did, but I may be kind of naive, that partly with the Black Lives Matter started and with George Floyd's death, I saw so many white people joining those marches. And I had not seen it that much before on those kinds of marches for the killing of Black people. I'm also impressed with young people. I think there's future for the country, not only for new immigrants, but young people that are growing up that are different from their parents and especially their grandparents. So it's kind of like I see as this racism is raising its head, so are other people white people raising their head and saying, this is not okay.
I think that's true, and I find myself thinking of my father, who was executive director of the National Urban League throughout the 60s, considered one of the big six of the civil rights movement. And he said once, I don't care about how white people feel, I care about what they do.
Yeah.
And in his speech at the March on Washington, and I reflect on this when I spoke at the Women's March and in other contexts, that we have to distinguish between symbols and substance. And to be at the march is a symbolic first step. But then we have to march to the voter registration booths. We have to march to city council. And when I say march in that regard, what I'm saying is that we have to be involved, we have to be educated, we have to be cognizant of the issues, and we have to speak to them on a regular basis. So as those predominantly peaceful protests for social justice occurred really, truly, largely peaceful, no question about it, occurred, then what happens next? What are the policies that will change? How will we fight for democracy? Here in the state of Colorado, it was really striking to me that we had to legislate, and we were one of a handful of states that legislated the Crown Act that allowed women who have natural hair like mine not to be discriminated against or experience repercussions at work. One of the reasons why we at the Women's Foundation are doing a whole series of public policy advocacy training throughout the state, and this year they'll be on Zoom. Last year they were in person, or I guess maybe before last year. I'm losing track of time. I don't know.
Time is a problem lately.
Time is a problem right now. I don't know where I am. But, you know, that's one way, and certainly the League of Women Voters in educating people about the issues is also essential. We also have to remember that the suppression of the vote has been going on for a period of time, for years. And I know that my father, who was there for the signing of the Voting Rights Act, is rolling in his grave, as they say, to think, as were all of those leaders, John Lewis being the last among them who died recently, never imagined that at that time, which is why John Lewis remained such a strong advocate for voting. And I want everyone to register, everyone to be educated, everyone to vote. They don't all have to agree with me, but the process of our democracy, the respect, the sacred right of our democracy must be upheld, it must be protected. It cannot be vilified in any way, shape, or form by violent mobs of white supremacy.
Absolutely. Lauren, you mentioned your father twice.
Yeah.
And it leads me to another question, and I think some
and
people
yay,
out
mommy
there
too.
might, yay, mommy too.
Yay,
Okay,
mommy
that's
too.
where I'm going. I want to know, I mean, I can hear you now, and you've been an advocate for so many people that are, well, they're, what's the right word? Disparaged against, whether it's race or gender or whatever it is. Where did you get the spark? Who were your mentors? Was there an epiphany when you were young or when you were older? Was there any kind of attack on you personally that motivated you? I want to know where this all comes from.
Where does this all come from? Well, both my sister and I would say that it's in our DNA. Even going back to my grandparents who ran a school for black students. It was a boarding school that was to teach them janitorial skills and agricultural skills in Jim Crow, Kentucky. They translated agriculture into engineering and math and science and reading and writing and all of those things so they could go on to historical black colleges, HBCUs. And my grandmother, Mother Dear, was the first black postmaster general for the state of Kentucky. But before you get too excited about it, you know, the one, you know, the exceptional, the thing that I saw when we would spend summers with my grandparents was their opening doors of opportunities for so many young people. My grandmother was not content that she would be the first. She wanted to make sure she was not the last as well. And you know, my father fought in World War II, segregated troops with white officers, and that changed his life. That was when he chose to devote himself to race relations and to equality and fighting poverty. He was afraid for his soldiers. He was a sergeant, but with higher ranking white officers, returning to the Jim Crow South and being unable to use the GI Bill for housing and for education. The GI Bill, in fact, became the dividing line for the wealth gap that we see today. It was a significant part in the context of of hundreds of years of history. As for my own personal experience, we lived in Atlanta in the 1950s. I was born in 1953. Certainly the words that were most familiar to me in terms of reading were white and colored. Water fountains, bathrooms, restaurants, basic human needs. My ability to have access was immediately defined by my race. I attended segregated schools as well. Atlanta was also at that time, when you think about Rosa Parks and the South and busing, there was this energy and community meetings at, my home or, my parents' home or other neighborhood homes of just folks, regular folks who might be cleaning houses, or perhaps they were the black doctor my parents taught at Spelman and what is now Clark Atlanta University. But the next thing, if I'm going to evolve a few years, when I was 16, I spent the summer with a very small group of students, maybe 8 or 10 of us, with 2 young adult supervisor chaperones with us. I was the only black student among the group. And during that trip, we visited several countries, but spent 3 weeks in Czechoslovakia and 3 weeks in Yugoslavia. Czechoslovakia in 1970 was still under the rule, the oppression of Russia. There had been the Russian invasion in 1968, so it was under Russian occupation. If you want to marshal in an understanding of freedom and democracy, spending time as a young person in a country filled with Russian tanks and Russian soldiers will do it. While my parents were involved in the fight for civil rights in America for black people and against racist systems that had existed, I saw in a global context something profound that had happened there. In Yugoslavia, which was under Tito's rule, again, so it was under communist rule. In retrospect, I used to ask my mom, like, what did I do that y'all sent me there? But anyway,
banishment.
Yeah, like, what
you haven't
happened?
lived up yet.
But they believed. My sister had been to Auschwitz. I mean, that's a part of the horror of what we saw at the Capitol. The anti-Semitism as well, the horror of what occurred. And so in Yugoslavia, I was injured. I was on crutches. So I'm young, I'm 16, I'm black, I'm female, I'm temporarily disabled, I'm from another country and I don't speak the language. And the director of the youth hostel offered to help me down. I'd gone to dinner alone. The group had gone into town. At the youth hostel, I stayed back because I was on crutches. And he offered to walk me down to my room and came back later with a master key, and a violent rape attempt occurred. And he was clear as they brought in magistrates. There was a hurried effort. There was no American embassy or anything of that sort, but my father had been in the International Herald Tribune. Around that time, there was concern about an international incident, and I was able to easily identify he was caught. People caught him running out of the room after my screams. Crutches can be very useful, by the way, when they are used. But I've also seen them. It struck me in the attack on the Capitol. I saw them used to attack an officer. And that context just really struck me, that we can turn things that are designed to help, but into and weaponize white privilege. But in any case, there was this exchange through an interpreter with me and these magistrates. I'm alone. What I learned at that time is how important it is to have compassion and empathy understanding and dialogue, and provide support for people whose history has left them denigrated, marginalized, and outside, whose language prevents them from understanding systems, whether it's healthcare, whether it is voting, whether it's criminal justice, whatever it may be, immigration. And because I was suddenly completely isolated in a system I didn't understand. And his excuse for me, you know, the attack on me, the rape attempt as a young woman who was temporarily disabled was apparent. But then he said that what he wanted was to touch, He wanted to touch my black skin. So this was back in 1970, and the acceleration of the sense of power and supremacy that he felt he had over me for all of those reasons that made me vulnerable, to be quite honest, Dottie, stick with me to this day. They drive my work on behalf of those who don't have voice. And voice, again, voice should be used, whether I agree or disagree with you, but with respect. Voice should be used in ways that move us forward. Voices should not be used to call for the death of anyone within our government at any time, anyone. And so, but it also sticks with me as a woman to this day, right? I'm 67 now. So 51 years later, I sleep with my bedroom door locked and pillows that frame my back for a sense of protection. That kind of assault, and I feel some of that visceral when I saw George Floyd being murdered. You know, those 8 minutes and 56 seconds when I watched what was happening at the Capitol, the beating of officers, the chasing of officers, the words that were shouted. That gets in your body, it gets in your spirit.
Your body is there ready for it because of what happened to you.
Yes,
Yeah.
And I think it's also a history as a woman and as a proud Black American. And it doesn't mean that I don't feel shame for episodes in the history of the United States, but I am a proud American who holds hope, not because a few people marched, and that was wonderful, but that's just the beginning. The fact that Congress did come back and completed their duties, that an election was found to be fair, and the rightful winner of that, President-elect Joe Biden, was acknowledged in that process. That similarly gave me hope. By the time this airs, I have no idea what will have happened.
No, we don't.
But similarly, I feel when I think about, again, women and Black women who organized from around the country, writing postcards, urging people to vote, helping people to register, a full range of people who may not have otherwise had the information. And it was a very quiet organizing movement. But, you know, my father also said, and it's eerie, at the March on Washington, and he spoke just before Martin Luther King did, that the drums of discontent are beating and they can be heard around the globe. These drums of discontent can no longer be ignored. And to be honest, that gives me hope, that the undercurrent, if we understand and fully embrace the power of our democracy for all people, doesn't mean we always agree, but for all people, and respect the processes and the rights and privileges that we have, then yes, I will have hope. But, you know, corporations, individual politicians, you know, school boards, like, it's everybody. Families.
And it's starting to happen.
It's everybody. The conversation has to continue to be deeper and stronger, and it's hard.
And we don't know where we're going to be when this airs. You know, we don't know what's going to have happened. So short term could be still very messy. But I'm gathering from you that long term you feel hope. And what are when you say democracy and people getting more energized than walking in a march, what do you see specifically us doing, I doing, you know, as an elderly white woman? But, you know, or just what are some of those specific things?
I think there are a few things. I think, you know, there are programs all over the country where very diverse young women are learning about civic engagement. They're choosing to run for office. They are participating in meaningful ways to have their voices heard. Again, non-violently, respectfully, but passionately, based on their own lived experience. The Women's Foundation of Colorado recently announced a Women and Girls of Color Fund. We know that organizations led by and supporting women and girls of color are undervalued and underinvested, receive 0.5% of foundation funding nationally. I believe that through that support, which is an equity approach, you can have universal goals, and sometimes you need targeted strategies to help to provide the necessary opportunities for economics. I also believe that, you know, there are conversations that are going on within business, not only about their investments, but what do their workforces look like? Who is or is not at the table? And Dottie, you know, you were a part of that. There are a number of women whose names we can say here in the state of Colorado who ran for office early, right? Not always successfully.
Yes, mostly not, but
mostly
we did.
Not, but you did it. You took the risk. You took the risk and moved forward. When I think of some of the young women leaders within our legislature today, even, extraordinary, right? Like, I talked about standing on shoulders. I mean, they are so far beyond either of us.
Oh, absolutely.
Their confidence, their awareness, their courage of conviction, their leadership with that is unapologetic, right? And yet with dignity and pride and strength. You can be both unapologetically something, this is who I am, this is what I believe, without tearing down the hallowed halls that should represent all of us.
One of the things that impresses me with the young people, but the young women particularly that are running, they'll get out there whether they're married and have kids, whether they are transgender, whether they have things that they, 10, 20, 30 years ago would have held them back. It was like, I can't do both, or if somebody knows I'm this, I can't run, or if I don't know it all, I can't run. It's probably what took me so long. I fell into that trap. But I think feminism has done that for a lot of young women that feel, not they can have it all. That's not the important question, that they can do it all.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've given a lot of mixed messages.
Yeah.
Bring home the bacon fried up in the pan, all that stuff.
And then if you have time.
Right, and yet if we consider what's happening now in this pandemic, I am on Zoom after Zoom after Zoom, where a mother who has a child crying in the background or crawling over her or, whatever it may be, apologizes. And I'm like, again, be unapologetic about that. That's your life. That's your life. That's real right now. And if our schools aren't open, childcare. Like, you have to have the support systems, not just now, but we have to ask ourselves, how do we co-create and reimagine a future that is truly inclusive and equitable, one that supports democracy, one that is intolerant at all costs of white supremacy and any of the variations thereof, the forms in which it can exist. And a part of that is similarly asking ourselves for women, and there's some men, I've seen the kids crawling over, guys who are now suddenly saying like, whoa, I didn't know this is what it was like.
To stay home.
Yeah, I had no idea this was
That's
what
the
was
side
happening.
benefit of isolation.
That's right. But we can't forget, and we have a tendency to forget. I think what 2021 has done for us, we were all like, woo, 2020's over. And the magic switch was going to be, and we could forget. And now we realize, right, those of us who've never been able to forget are now saying to folks, no one can forget all of the lessons that we have learned this year, all of the cracks and the vulnerabilities that exist that now need to be either raised up or filled. The word healing is not enough, right? That's not enough.
You can heal and go back to where you were.
Yes, exactly. That can be a scab, but that scar, the depth of that scar, that visceral sense that I carry in my body, right? I'm walking, I'm talking, I'm functioning in the world, but it's not enough. It's not enough for us to ensure that the kind of experience that I had, that sense of entitlement that man had toward me, is no longer possible or acceptable, that justice will occur. So, I think that, the work is moving on, and that gives me hope, and it's not going to be easy at all.
This is maybe going back a little bit too much and a side issue, but feeling so strongly right now about justice, was that man brought to justice in Czechoslovakia? Or do you know?
What I do know is that as my group got on a bus so we could get out of there real quick, finally, right? A couple of days after this event. And I won't say event, it was a rape attempt. Like, we got to stop using euphemisms, right? It was not an event at the Capitol, right?
Like it's some social thing.
It wasn't a concert, right? We got to stop using euphemisms for the truth. But he ran alongside the bus screaming at me. And the interpreter told me that he was screaming obscenities and threatening me, et cetera, et cetera. So suddenly he translated that he had been victimized, and as it turned out, my understanding was that he had been caught and suspected, alleged peeping Tom, but not brought, situations not brought to justice. I don't know the truth around that. What happened to me was unequivocal. It was unequivocal. But whether justice occurred, I don't know. I don't know.
I think it might be time to wind up, but I want you to wind it up. And I want you to think of anything you have not said that you would like to say.
You and I talked a little bit about leadership and what is leadership. And, leadership is a privilege in and of itself. The representation of others and accountability to others. And I think it begins with showing up, paying attention, and telling the truth. The truth is really essential. And again, not euphemistically, but telling the real truth, as hard as it may be. And then, I read once that the difference between leaders and managers is that leaders need to identify what is right. And managers do that the right way. And both are essential, there's no question. Absolutely. But somebody has to point the way. Somebody needs to have that vision, but then they need people who will help them to do it well, you know, to make sure it is feasible, and that the goal is ultimately accomplished. Something just struck me. I'd like to share, actually, I guess in closing, something from I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, Maya Angelou. And I'm not quite sure, from an editing perspective, we might have to pause.
You have the exact
because
quote?
I left it over there. My memory no longer.
You can paraphrase.
No, I don't know that I can paraphrase, but you know, in essence, it says that the cage bird trills in fear, but the cage bird sings of freedom, right? And so the acknowledgement of both and of some fear, legitimate fear that has been felt by our country is real, but the opportunity for freedom, for liberation, is for independence of the human spirit from a place of love for this country and for each other is possible. So y'all will have to read. You'll have to look up I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings yourselves probably.
The singing is the yearning and the going toward freedom.
Freedom.
And that's a great place to end. And this has been just delightful, Lauren. And I congratulate you again. And you will be a leader for these girls and women and everybody else that's disenfranchised in Colorado and in the nation. We all look up to you.
Well, our job is to pass the baton.
It's true.
That's
and
our
my
job.
gosh, they're picking it up, aren't they?
Yeah, they sure are.
They sure are.
So
okay,
thank
good.
you to you
Yeah.
and to the League of Women Voters. I'm very honored.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Delight.